in case any of the public joiners are going to get creative with the distractions. So Joel is here.
Joel and Julian are both here. And Jeff said that he's joining.
Jeff is joining and still waiting on Roberta.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I swear people don't read. They're joining random like Google Meet links that were posted weeks ago because I'm getting notifications like someone's now waiting in your waiting room or whatever.
Oh, geez. Yeah, if you can help filter all those people on over to here.
Yep, I'm doing that. I got
That'd be great. We've got a fun talk lined up here and a fun discussion, I'm sure. Goes for everyone that's waiting in here as well. If you'd like to share this with any colleagues or so on, please feel free.
Yeah, we're definitely about where I thought we would be for attendance, about 30 people. Just
hopefully a few more will filter in.
Okay, so Roberta's here, Julian's here, Joel's here. Now we're just waiting on Jeff, but
Jeff is joining.
Okay. Yeah.
No worries. The actual talk portion I have should only be around a half hour, so we should have plenty of time here.
Yep.
You've got space for the recording file and such, right?
Yeah, we're good. Don't worry.
Yep. Just making sure. Number of times that's happened, I can't even tell you.
Oh boy, that sucks. Yeah, let me look at my old recordings just to make sure. Oh my gosh. Oh yeah, okay. Everyone's here. We can start.
Yeah, so Lewis, up to you if you want to tweet the Zoom link directly. We've had bad experiences with that in the past. Technically, people can only chat here, so that's about the worst they can do.
Okay,
But
let's just share it directly. Yeah, if someone wants to tweet it,
if you get spam in the chat, you get spam in the chat. Just know that this happens with these things, and there's not much we can do about it without limiting participation in the chat. Everyone good? We have all the panelists have co-host privileges, can unmute and all that?
Yep. Okay. Do you want me to do that? Sorry.
Just allow them to, if you can just, give them the privileges. If they want to start video, if they want to unmute, just so that they have the permissions to do that, since everyone else is off by default.
Let's see. So, I think they can unmute now.
Okay. You can just check in chat in case anything's, settings are messed up there. We have Jeff's good. Yeah, we're good. Okay, great. Let's get
Oh,
started then. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for your interest in this proposal, and thank you to our panelists for helping to evaluate this proposal and to iron out any of the details. A little bit about me. I'm Joseph. I'm at MIT. I've been here now. This is my 4th year in Phillips Lab. I've been working on neural MMO for even longer than that, and I'm involved in a few other open source projects in and around reinforcement learning, mostly looking at how we can take the current RL frameworks that we have and make them applicable to more and more complex environments as research goes forward. I'm also currently working on taking some of the tools that I've built into neural MMO over the years out of neural MMO and making them more generally applicable to other environments and other problems, as well as making neural MMO itself applicable to more areas of research, hence this proposal on task conditional reinforcement learning and open-ended curriculum generation. Long-term, the goal with all of this is to get agent-based research on complex, cognitively realistic, if not physically realistic environments by default. So if it's just as easy to do research on a complex, compelling environment as it is on Atari, that's where research will go. This proposal is highly inspired by XLand, the seminal DeepMind result in which the authors are able to get policies to generalize to tasks not seen during training by training over a wide curriculum of different tasks. The goal of this proposal is XLand, but as a competition, modulo some details to make it more friendly for the competition format, as well as for academic skills and compute, plus a little bit of neural MMO flair so that we keep the problem fresh, given that XLand already exists. XLand occupies this sort of middle ground between being a single environment and being an arbitrary platform for creating whatever environments you want. And this is a very favorable space to occupy. All the way on the left, on the single environment side, it is very easy to define tasks and goals over a single environment. However, the applicability becomes somewhat limited in that you don't know if the results you have in this one environment are going to generalize to other environments and so on. On the right side, if you were able to get anything to work over an arbitrary environment engine that can define whatever environment you want, that would be very general and very powerful, but it's very hard to define success over that wide distribution of potential environments. And in the middle, you have something like XLand, where it's not one environment. There's flexible definitions over the configurations of that environment. There's procedural generation of maps, potentially procedural generation of tasks, but everything that you do in XLand is still going to be XLand. And obviously there are a bunch of asterisks on all of these statements. This is sort of a general overview. This is an environment provided by Neural MMO, which occupies a very similar space to XLand. So this is a small map that's provided. It could be different size, 32 by 32, 16 agents, and these agents can observe a 15 by 15 crop of tiles around them. They get the local state space equivalent of what you see on the screen, so it's much more computationally efficient. And then they can move around in the environment in the 4 cardinal directions. They can attack other agents with a couple of strategic options. They can target directly. And then there are also some additional mechanics, such as foraging for food and water in order to survive in this. So the main question to start here is, why use Neural MMO for an XLand type competition? The initial arguments are that it's open source and computationally efficient. These are more or less requirements for the competition format. And this immediately takes a lot of other potential candidates out of the running. But we can come up with much better reasons than this. First of all, XLand has already been done. Most of their tasks are 2 agents. Let's scale up complexity in terms of the number of agents that we're looking at. In previous competitions, we've run on 128 by 128 maps with 128 agents grouped into teams. The platform as a whole can actually get a lot larger than this, up to 1024 by 1024 with 1024 agents. And really the only limitation in going even further than this is just optimizations to the renderer. If we did a little bit of engineering there, we could scale even larger if we wanted to. The other way of scaling complexity is in terms of the mechanics. This could also be phrased as the complexity of the game dynamics or the environment dynamics, or the complexity of just looking at it as a game itself. How interesting is the stuff that you can do within it? This is the latest version of Neural MMO. There's a lot more going on than on the previous one. Here you have an item system with 160 different items that are grouped into armor, weapons, consumables, equipment, ammunition, tools, and lots of other stuff. There are 8 different professions that are grouped into 5 gathering professions, 3 combat professions. You can actually progress these professions over the course of a singular episode. All the professions interact and relate with each other in interesting ways, creating cool dependency chains between different professions and different specialties. There's a loot system in which there are scripted agents that run around the map. You can defeat them to get various different resources, and there's a lot of other interesting stuff going on in this environment as well. Generally, it just much more closely resembles a full game. Oh yeah, one other thing to note, with these items, you can actually even buy them and sell them on an exchange back and forth with each other. So there's a full economy system that can sort of emerge dynamically from this. But really the main reason to use Neural MMO is that it's already proven in a competition setting. We've run 2 major competitions, one at Ichikai that's already been wrapped up. We already have the full analysis for this, and we had some quite good emergent behaviors from this. And then also the NeurIPS challenge, which there are a couple days left to submit to this. So if you're interested in doing so, please go right ahead. In total, we've run 3 competitions. There was an earlier one that was just in partnership with AI Crowd that was smaller scale, not at a conference, but then the later 2, the Ichikai one being additionally in partnership with Parametrics AI, and then the NeurIPS one additionally being sponsored by AWS. On top of that, these last 2 competitions were some of the largest reinforcement learning competitions in the past few years, if you look at the number of uniquely submitting participants. And we were quite pleased with this, given that the environment that is used in Neural MMO is a lot more complex and the barrier to entry is quite high. So being able to get this level of participation in a competition that is this complex was quite good for us. Importantly, we were challenging participants to create not just one agent, but a team of agents. So you control 8 agents. There are 16 total teams in any given environment for a total of 128 agents. Because this is a competition setting, the exact framing of the evaluation structure is very important. You want to be able to provide participants with fast feedback as soon as they make a submission, and then more accurate feedback on sort of a more sparse interval whenever is computationally efficient for you to do so. So participants will train their agents over distributions of randomly generated environments, or they'll script an agent using those randomly generated environments for testing to inform their development. They will submit their policy to us, and we will immediately evaluate it against 15 other teams of open source scripted agents. And they can even train against these agents if they wanted to directly, given that they're open source. If the participant does reasonably well in this round, they go on to the second round, in which they're up against fixed policies that we have trained, reinforcement learned, that were not made open source until the end of the competition. So here it's a fixed opponent, but you can't train against it directly. And if they get a good score on that, they go on to stage 3, which is up against a much stronger reinforcement learned policy that we have trained that they, again, do not have access to during the competition. If they do reasonably well on the first stage, then they go into the PvP submission pool. And once a week, we will run a whole bunch of games where we sample 16 policies from the submission pool to control 16 different teams, and they can duke it out in a big shared environment, and we can see which agents are really able to accomplish the task set out for them in the presence of a whole bunch of different policies that are trying to do the same thing that they couldn't anticipate, they couldn't adapt for, and that were not seen during training. Now, there's a little bit of complexity with doing any sort of competition on an environment like this. So at the bottom, there is the network structure that we provided for the baseline. This was not known to participants until the end of the competition. However, the top participants ended up coming up with a very similar structure. And this is something that will be familiar if you have seen large-scale industry work like OpenAI 5 or AlphaStar, or if you'd followed other similar competitions. And the core network in this is actually quite simple. It's just an LSTM. That's sort of the green block towards the right third of this figure. Everything to the left of this is a domain-specific observation encoder. Can you turn off drawing?
Oh my God. Well, what? Where?
I turned that off. I don't know how that got turned back on. Okay. How do we clear this?
Oh God.
Can you just
Sorry.
remove whoever that was and clear this? This happens, public presentation. We're expecting this.
Sorry. I don't.
No worries.
How do
This
I
will just get cut out of the clip anyways.
unshare screen? Yeah, unshare screen for a second.
Will do.
Uh,
And share again and it's gone.
Wait. Does anyone know how to?
I think I turned it off. We're good. There was another option that popped up on drawing that wasn't there for me to disable before. My bad.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mark. Okay. All right, let's continue.
So anyways, domain-specific network. The reason that you need something like this is because all of these complex environments end up having different modalities of data. So you have scalar features, you have 2D map data, and you have order invariant set data. So in order to just encode this into something that can be put into a flat LSTM, you're going to need MLPs, CNNs, and some sort of attentional or transformer-based network, and that's all that's happening on the left side. And then on the right side, you have a domain-specific action decoder, and this is because it's not just a few fixed k-way softmax actions. There are a couple more complex things as well in there, such as pointer actions. So for instance, if you want to target a specific opponent for an attack, you actually have to select the corresponding embedding from the input. So this is a little bit different from the standard softmax. The good news is once you have all of this set up, as we do now having run these competitions, we can simply provide this as part of the starter kit. And then participants already have all of this in place to build off of, and really the environment looks like any other much simpler environment, even though all this is happening under the hood, and really they only have to worry about network modifications to the core. Okay, so there are a lot of different ways that you can explain some of the complexities in the environment, but the best way to do this is just going to be to show a few demos from the competition.
I'll kick people. Give me 1 sec.
Is this still showing? Are we good here? Lewis?
Yep. Oh, I
Okay.
can still see your screen.
Okay, and it seems the resolution is a little bit off of the full screen, but bear with me here. So what we're gonna do, actually I don't have the camera controls because it's resolutioned weirdly. 1 second. Okay, so this is the web viewer that was available for the IchKai competition. You can see a high-level view of the environment here, and this was the first policy, the first replay, I should say rather, of the top policy. So this is not cherry-picked at all. This is just, the first replay that I found, and it'll be the same thing for the NeurIPS one as well. So what we're going to do here is we're going to advance the simulation by a few steps, and we're going to see that the agents here of the passerby team, which is the top submitted policy, will spawn in. If we zoom in a little bit and see what passerby is doing, can you prevent people from requesting remote control of my screen, please?
Can I?
That would be good. I'm getting spam requests.
Oh my God.
Whatever.
Okay.
So at the left here with passerby,
Right. I'm
it's
deleting
going
the
to
tweet.
commit a few agents to this fight on the left against the agents that spawn near it.
I deleted the tweet, by the way. Who's spamming you? I'll just kick them.
Ramwell Spurs, if you can just kick him from the chat, please. I think they have a couple of accounts, though. They're committing one agent to this fight on the right. So they're going to actually lose a couple agents as a result of committing these two agents here and this one agent here to this fight. And if we just play forward a little bit, you can see that they've lost two agents. But this is not necessarily a bad thing, because what you have to keep in mind is that if they had not committed those agents to this fight, the agents on the other side would have just moved in anyways and taken up that space. So what they've won by taking this fight early on is creating themselves some space. Let's see what these four agents in the middle can actually do with this space now that they have it. We're going to be following passerby 95 for the rest of this demo. You're going to be looking at the equipment score here and then the leveling here. Because what we're going to actually see is that this agent is going to very quickly fight these various different scripted NPCs and farm up levels. There it gets into a fight against the here policy, which it did not really hope to do. It got into a 1v2, but it was just barely able to win because it got that advantage so early on. If we're looking at the equipment score, it's now up to 21, continuing to level. Strong enough yet? Nope, go up to 22. How about now? Still no, going to continue farming on, now up to 25, and now up to 28. Now it's very strong and can go aggressive against that pink policy on the bottom left, which is another user-submitted agent. Watch it track down this kill, and there you have it. Now you're going to see this agent is shifting gears, because it is very strong and it can take whatever fights it wants, so it's going to start looking for kills on other user-submitted policies. Look how much it's exploring the map compared to at the start of the episode. It's still fighting these scripted agents, but really just incidentally as it happens to run into them. It's going to very shortly here find this agent here, yep, on the bottom right, and it's going to track this down. It only saw one of them, it has a limited vision range, but it picked up this kill here. So you can see how there are different phases to this policy. There's sort of the initial divide and sacrifice a couple agents. There's the early power leveling, so to speak, phase. And then at the end, there is this aggressive hunting phase. If we scroll all the way to the end of this episode now, which is about a 10-minute long game, we see that Passerby is tied for first with two other policies. And importantly, it has an equipment score of 28, which actually matches the agent that we followed. So the reason it was able to get this high equipment score, this achievement, which goes directly into its scoring function for whether it wins the game overall, came from the agent that we followed and from its actions. We're now going to take a quick look at a NeurIPS replay. Here you can see the environment looks a little bit different. There are a ton of new resources that were not available in the Ichkai environment. The reason that we looked at the Ichkai replay first is it's a little simpler to understand what's going on. The new environment is much more of a full game, and a lot of the complexity has to do with the items that agents are picking up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a higher level view of this, and then we're going to look at the end state and see what the agent did well and what maybe it could have done better. So here's the environment as a whole. We're going to be following Relicune, which is the top submitted policy at this time. The competition is not yet wrapped up. We can see it has a bunch of agents here, and you'll notice that the agents spawn farther apart than in the Ichkai competition. This was done intentionally to give teams a little bit of more of a fighting chance to do something interesting at the start. We're going to watch Relicune split into two groups to start with. 4 agents went one way, 4 agents went the other way. I'm just going to get into some initial very early fights, but committing pretty much the whole team to this rather than just a couple agents like in the Passerby example from the other competition. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to watch the overall motion of these agents throughout the competition at high speed for the next minute or so. 2 teams have split up. 1 agent has gotten separated and is sort of on its own here, but you're going to see it's actually going to find its way all the way back to its team in just a minute here. So there you go. If you look on the left, you'll also see indicators when they lose an agent. So they just lost Relicune 17 there, and they lost 23 and 22. So they likely got into a bad fight there. They're still 2 separate groups though, and they're very heavily exploring into the map. The edges of the map that are coming in here, this is a poisonous fog, so to speak. This is a common mechanic in Battle Royale type games that pushes players towards the center of the map. And this was a new addition in the NeurIPS competition. So they're still in 2 teams. They're really exploring almost all of the map here, potentially looking for early fights, potentially looking to get resource advantages. You really have to watch in very close detail and spend quite a bit of time to see exactly what's going on. It does seem that they messed up on the bottom team and they lost all but 1 agent there. And they're going to lose this agent in just a moment as well. You see that there's 1 separate team. There's the 1 agent that is separated, has not found its way back yet. You'll also notice that they're playing a little bit in the edges of the fog here. This is actually a strategy that a lot of Battle Royale players end up using because the edges of the fog typically only do a small amount of damage and you're less likely to encounter opponents there. That said, if you get lost in the fog like happens to that agent right there, then you're not going to have too good of a time. And here the fog is at its smallest point almost, and we're just going to see the end of the episode right like this. Okay, now we can zoom in and see if we can understand what this agent has done. So first of all, there are a total of 4 player agents left alive. 2 from Edward Groh's team, 1 from Varun, and then the Relicune agent. If we look at this Relicune agent here, agent 18, this is its inventory state. And you have to have a little bit of knowledge about the different types of items and what they do. So I'm going to try to summarize here. First, we'll notice there are 3 pieces of armor. There's an armor bottom, there's a top, and there's a helmet. The number under them, V, I, V, and VI, indicate the level of that piece of equipment. What is going on here is that this agent has acquired high-level protective equipment that allows it to take a lot more damage during combat. So it is very difficult to kill this agent. However, it has a very low-level weapon. We will go back to that in a moment. It also has a couple of those apples, which are rations, which allows it to immediately heal lost food or lost water. So if it needs to get out of a dangerous spot, it doesn't have to worry about gathering those resources. It just can focus on escaping. And then it also has that potion on the bottom left, and that will allow it to immediately heal a portion of its health, again, if it gets into a bad situation in combat. And you can also see it has a whole stack of 99 gold at the top left of the inventory right there. Let's go back to that sword right there, because this is the one thing that I think is potentially a mistake, and that is a potential room for improvement in future policy. It's because there's a sort of a complicated mechanic by which you can get better weapons. In fact, if we look at all these other agents right now, we're going to see that they all have the same thing going on here. Level 1 sword, level 1 sword. I don't even know if this one has a sword to begin with. I can't click it, whatever. None of them have high-level weapons. So this is because the way that you get better weapons and are actually be able to be effective in the late game combat requires that you interact with the profession system a little bit more. And this will just show you a bit of the complexity in neural MMO. So in order to get a sword, you have to cut down trees. Doesn't make a lot of high-level sense, but you'll see the balance of it in a bit. If you cut down a tree, there is a small chance that you will randomly find a sword. The level of the sword that you find depends on the level of the tool that you use to cut down that tree. If you don't have a tool, you will get a level 1 sword. Additionally, you can only equip a tool that's as high as the level of the corresponding profession. So this is supposed to say carving. Carving is the skill that is used to cut down and fletch trees into ammunition. And if you have a level 3 carving ability and you had, let's say, a level 3 chisel to go with it, then you could potentially find a level 3 sword. As we look here, this has level 3 carving, it has gold, and there is in fact a level 3 chisel on the market right here that it could buy. So if it were to simply buy this chisel and then go cut down these trees and do this for a while, it would be able to get a higher level weapon, and then it would be able to defeat other agents. This requires understanding the profession system though, and how it interacts, and sacrificing a little bit of time that you could be using for other things in order to get yourself this equipment. There are a few other interactions like this that agents could make use of throughout the course of an episode. For instance, if it were to level up the prospecting skill, it could go mine those red tinted ore rocks at the top of the screen and get ammunition, sort of like a blade oil, so to speak, that also will enhance the damage of its melee attack with that sword. This is just to show that there's some additional complexity that has not yet been fully exploited in the environment, and there's potential for task-based stuff around interacting with these various mechanics in the future.
There's a question in chat. Which of these agents was RL based and which one was scripted?
So we're not going to know that until the end of the NERPS competition, but I will mention that right now for the Ichikai competition. So one very important thing in the Ichikai competition, the top 2 submissions were both pure reinforcement learning. This is not something that typically happens in competitions. Typically, reinforcement learning will fall behind at least until you've run the competitions a few times over and people have had the time to get that approach. So the 2 neural approaches in the top 5 are Neural Noob, which was our number 2, and Passerby, which was our number 1. Another interesting thing about this is all the top 5 submissions, you can see they explore the environment in different ways. So on the very left and on the very right, here in double Z, these end up exploring the environment in sort of like outside on the edges, which is a sort of a safer way to explore if you think that Passerby is going to be towards the center, this much more aggressive agent. So this is a more passive strategy, and they tend to play as a team. Whereas Passerby is playing sort of in split groups towards the center of the map, and then after going to the center of the map, as we saw in that one episode, we'll explore more heavily and more aggressively, and then you have somewhere in between with Master Kong Kong and Neural Noob, in which they're sending at least some agents to the center of the map, but there seems to be some additional exploration as well. Now we can see these same maps, but aggregated over 50 episodes at the bottom here, and this allows us to get a sense of where agents are spending their time in the environment. So on the left here spends most of its time on the edges, Master Kong Kong spends a bunch of time in the middle, but mostly around specific areas that it seems to find to like. Neural Noob is a sort of a more even distribution, Passerby is this almost Gaussian-like thing focused on the center of the map, and then Double Z is this interesting case where it's almost bimodal. You can see that there's some highlighted area towards the center, but then there's also a decent bit around the edges. So as I was mentioning before, the top 2 approaches, both reinforcement learning, so BT, behavioral tree, or role-based methods, they actually start off beating on the left, beating reinforcement learning, but during the course of this Ichikai competition, reinforcement learning agents take over towards the end. If you look at the graph on the right, though, it tells a little bit of a different story, which is that actually it's very hard to beat rule-based methods against simpler opponents. The 2 stars at the top, indicate that reinforcement learning only beat out behavioral tree or role-based agents at the very end of the competition. But in the third round against more complicated agents, as well as in the PvP round, the bottom star there, reinforcement learning was really dominant early on. And we attribute this to potentially over-optimizing the reinforcement learning strategies based on knowing a fixed opponent. Whereas you can't really do that with RL, but hopefully it's more robust. We also can look at the performance of the top 5 submissions in the course of these different stages to confirm this. So in the first stage, all of the top 5 got a perfect score of 84. In the second stage, we had a couple top scores, a couple perfect scores, including one of the scripted agents, Master Kong Kong. However, this falls off very sharply in the third stage, at which point the reinforcement learned approaches are dominant. And we can see that from Last Order and Neural Noob. And in fact, Last Order does even better in the final PvP stage versus in the PvE stage 3. Okay, this is all just to give you some sort of understanding of what Neural MMO has done, how it's been used in the competition scene, potentially what could be done with it, and what infrastructure is sort of already in place to support this competition. Xland has these procedurally generated physics-based environments in which there are various different objects that spawn that you can interact with around each of the environments. It also defines tasks over these environments. If you've seen the Clever visual question answering dataset, they'll be somewhat familiar. So Clever is this older visual question answering dataset in which you ask procedurally generated questions about procedurally generated images. So for instance, is the small cylinder behind the large sphere? Why, yes, yes it is. Using a similar relational structure, you can describe tasks over Xland environments. So hold opponent yellow pyramid, the opponent should be holding a yellow pyramid, near black pyramid, me. I need to be near the black pyramid. You can define these relations or these tasks using on, see, near, and hold as sort of primary elements. And you can take as arguments to these the floor, which can be different colors, objects, which can be different colors and shapes, and then 2 reserved keywords, which are me and the opponent. And you can combine these with and, or, and not. Now, this may seem very simple, but the authors make the point that you can actually define fairly interesting tasks over the environment using the system. For instance, you can implement simple mini games like capture the flag or tag, and you can implement physics puzzles that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like preventing a ball from rolling down a hill. Neural MMO does have some sort of task system already. We used one in Ichkai. It was not a modular or combinatorial task system like Xland. We just sort of defined a few fixed task conditions in the environment at a few different levels of difficulty and went and saw what happened. So the 4 tasks that we defined are exploration across the map, foraging for resources, defeating scripted agents in the environment in order to get equipment, so defeating mobs or player versus environment stuff, so to speak, and then defeating other players in the environment, defeat the competition. 3 different levels of difficulty for these. And what we found is even with this very restricted task set, for any fixed score, policies would accomplish that score using a different combination of capabilities. So for instance, if you look at the bottom line, 21.34, and match that up to the sort of radar plot at the top left, you can see that the here policy is very good at foraging, whereas Mori is much more rounded, and Hicks, or whatever that is better at exploration. We can also look at which achievement is the most distinguishing or distinguishes between different policies at each stage of the competition. So in the first round, we see that more or less all the good policies figure out how to explore and forage, and then equipment and player defeats are the 2 main contested achievements, so to speak. In the second round, all the good policies additionally figure out how to get equipment, and then the contest is mostly based on who is better in player versus player combat. In stage 3, it starts to even out again, and all of the achievements become more contested, and then we see this effect magnified in the final PvE stage, where all of these achievements have an effect on your rank, which is a decent indication that they're probably fairly balanced. There are many ways that we could define a modular and relational system of tasks over Neural MMO, which was part of this proposal, is that we build one. This is sort of an initial set of relations that I came up with, and the goal here is not that these are the best relations, but to show you that you can already do a lot with these, and certainly we could iterate and improve on them. So inflicting damage of a specific quantity, defeating a certain a non-player character or another player of a given strength, achieving a level in a specific skill, harvesting a resource of a specific quality, or equipping a certain piece of armor or weapon or tool that gives you a certain stat bonus. Some of these are a little bit more intricate than they might initially appear. For instance, harvesting a certain quality resource requires that you not only have the skill to harvest a resource of that quality, but also have a tool of the corresponding strength in order to get that resource. So there's a little bit of game complexity associated with this already. And because of the trade system, even though these are more individualistic achievements, it will also probably make sense to play as a team in order to accomplish these. We also can write much more explicitly team-focused goals, such as hoarding a certain amount of gold among the team, grouping together or spreading apart, defending a specific teammate, or eliminating another team entirely. And like Xland, we can already start to implement some relatively interesting tasks just by combining these very simple elements. We can require that agents form a perimeter by spreading out, so not seeing each other, but also at the same time defending a player on the team. The way you do this is by putting a player in the center and then sort of forming a defensive line or a perimeter around them. You can require that agents specialize. Agents on the same team specialize in different professions or roles just by there being a limited amount of time, and requiring that as a team, they have at least one agent that has a high level and a number of different skills. You can require that the team as a whole play towards one larger and harder objective, such as getting very far into a specific combat style, so gaining a lot of levels and equipment for that combat style. So you might have to have lots of agents doing different things in order to help acquire that equipment. And then you can also implement simple mini games like Xland, such as some sort of King of the Hill type game. Okay, so this is all background that will make the proposed challenge a very natural and small extension of what has already been done. The goal is for participants to create policies that can generalize to increasingly disparate held out tasks. So you get to train on some tasks, you get evaluated on other tasks. As the distribution of evaluation tasks grows farther and farther away from the initial training distribution, we want policies to be as robust as possible. And like Xland, these will be on new maps that have never been seen before, but additionally, because it's neural MMO, it will also be against new opponents that have never been seen before. If we consider the structure from the previous competition, the smallest modification we can make in order to run this type of competition would be to replace running on randomly generated environments to generating both environments and tasks for training. And then instead of evaluating on a series of increasingly qualified opponents, you are evaluating against a series of increasingly disparate tasks. So randomly sampled tasks from the same distribution, adversarially mined tasks, and then even handcrafted tasks like were used in Xland. If you do well on the first stage, you get into the submission pool, and you're then tasked with doing all the same objectives, but against other user-submitted opponents. So how can you figure out to do tasks that you've never seen before, on maps you've never seen before, against opponents you've never seen before? In order to have this version of the competition, we would need around 10,000 GPU hours in order to develop the baselines. We would need contributors to help with the implementation of the task system. We would need some sort of research engineering type effort in order to help integrate gold conditioned modules with the current RL baseline, as well as to sort of clean it up and add all these additional techniques that were discovered from the NeurIPS and the IchCai competition. And then finally, we have a much more open-ended problem here, which is coming up with an initial curriculum generation baseline, which we do not currently have. There are two problems with this competition as proposed. The first is that it requires all participants to do both reinforcement learning and open-ended curriculum generation in order to be competitive. This is a lot to ask. The second problem is that it's not really fair in terms of compute. So there are participants that are going to feel that it's not really fair that they put in all this effort, even if they were willing to do both of these objectives, and then other companies are going to just have way more compute. They can have a much simpler approach, and they can still win. We're going to address both of these problems at once. First, we're going to separate out into two different tracks: the RL track, where you're only focused on improvements to the RL side, and then the curriculum generation task, in which you're only focused on that open-ended curriculum generation. Therefore, you can do whichever track you want, and if you're particularly ambitious, you can do both. There's actually going to be a separate third track in which you can do both of those jointly. So you just hand us a nice policy that's general, And this is because we do also want companies to be able to participate. They end up creating very capable policies that show us what's really possible if you scale in these environments. For tracks 1 and 2, for the compute fairness, we would be training the policies for the participants for a fixed 8A100 hours. This also means that even if you have no compute, you can still participate in the competition, essentially using your limited number of submissions as experiments. This would require an additional 40,000 A100 hours, but do note that if we were to use all 40,000 A100 hours, it would be to process 5,000 submissions, which, with decent rate limits, would make this one of the, if not the largest reinforcement learning and similar AI type competition ever run. Let's go into the 3 tracks in a little bit more detail here. In track 1, we provide the tasks, probably around 25,000 of them. And the objective is going to be to submit us a script that will train a model on those tasks. So you have no control whatsoever over the curriculum. Your only job is to figure out how to update the model in a way that produces something that is high quality and robust to new tasks. In the second track, you submit to us a script that generates training tasks, and we will define the RL baseline. You have no control over the reinforcement learning side at all. You're only focused on the curriculum. So you submit us a task, you observe the reward that the model gets, the model updates itself a little bit, and you just repeat this until you run out of your 8 hours. And in track 3, there are no limitations. You just give us a policy that generalizes to new tasks. We don't train it for you. You use whatever compute you want, and this hopefully pushes the results that are possible in the competition. And of course, we can then compare this co-adapted approach to the best curriculum generation approach submitted to us from the second track, paired with the best reinforcement learning approach from the first track, just stapled together end to end, and see how much of a difference there is when you can co-adapt and use more hardware. One thing that I really like about Neural MMO, and one of the reasons that I've spent so much time on it, is that it scales very well with the amount of development effort that you put in. With more engineering, you get more features in the environment, you get potentially more emergent behaviors that can be learned, and even more problems that can be studied within the platform. So if contributors are interested, there are a whole bunch of things that could be done in Neural MMO to make the competition even more impactful, and potentially to even enable new types of approaches. These include pure engineering tasks. For instance, there's a current infrastructure patch that's half finished that, if completed, would make the entire environment several times faster. There are other sort of mixed sort of engineering and research type goals, like coming up with new baselines or sort of new ways to structure the baselines. There are also things that can be done even on the sort of the less technical side with the documentation and the usability of the environment. So really, the competition is amenable to contributions from a wide audience here. And then long term, there is even the potential to add additional content to Neural MMO directly. The amount of strategies that were enabled by the 1.6 update used for NeurIPS compared to the 1.5 update used for IchKai, that was a huge gap. A similar thing could be done going forward. There's a huge gap between Neural MMO as it is now and the most complex MMOs that are actually out there on the game market now. And I believe that if we were able to actually have an environment like that and be able to train reinforcement learning agents on that, well, our agent-based intelligence capabilities would just be very far removed from what they are now. So that concludes this portion of the talk. We'll now move on to the panel discussion, and hopefully after that also be able to take some questions from chat. So thank you very much to everyone here.
Thanks, Joseph, for the great presentation. Let's take some quick comments first before we start the panel. I'd be interested to have fog for simpler tasks as time goes on. Items earned through the simpler tasks are removed and can't be regained. I'm thinking in the context. Oh, that's not really a question. Okay, so let's start on the panel then. Sorry, we can get to your comment later. Can the folks unmute themselves? Let's see. Jeff, Joel.
We're unable to start our videos.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, no, it's the same thing. Hey, Jeff.
Apparently, we need to, we can't unmute unless you request us to unmute.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know what it means that if we mute ourselves, we can't unmute ourselves. So we just have to be quiet when we
If you can fix that, Lewis, while we're starting this, that would be great. If not, well, we'll have to deal. It's an unfortunate side effect of putting all these security settings in place to avoid being trolled.
Yeah.
Right.
Unfortunate.
Hello, Julian.
Hello. Should we have cameras as well, or should we?
I think they're working on allowing us to turn our cameras on.
Yeah. I don't. Sorry.
I'm happy to fill out a capture proving I'm not a Russian conference breaker.
Yeah.
Should we just allow participants to unmute themselves? I doesn't look like we can do permission groups.
That sounds like a very bad idea.
Yeah,
I'd
that's not
rather
what
we
you
just
want.
deal with a little bit of background noise if required from the
Yeah.
panelists.
Okay.
So someone unmute Joel, and then we'll just keep ourselves unmuted.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Let me unmute Joel then. Where is he? There he is. And Roberta as well.
All right, I will just not mute myself again, just so muscle memory at this point.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you guys can take it over from here. I guess most of the questions that we had during preliminary discussions had to do with this inner loop component of applying open-endedness to evolve these kinds of tasks. So the first track that Joseph went over was one where we had a very few amount of tasks to train the agent on, and the goal there is that we would provide these very few tasks, and we would provide a diff model to allow you to mutate over tasks. And the hope is that the practitioners entering into the competition would use this diff model and these very few initial tasks to create a very large data set of tasks. And this very large data set of tasks could then be used on stability servers to train agents that would then be entered into the competition. So it's almost like a low resource version of neural MMO, where this resource is referring to the size of the data set rather than the amount of compute.
Yeah, and there is definitely the ability to use a bit more compute as well in order to actually generate the set of tasks as it is framed now. Because you can use however much compute you want to generate the tasks, and then you could just submit the tasks to track 2, but at least you're still going to be limited in the amount of compute that's used to train the final model. So there's at least, it's almost impossible to prevent compute from ever providing any advantage in the first couple of tracks, but at least there is a substantial limitation there.
I have a question for the organizers, which is maybe you could comment a little bit on to what extent you think this particular competition is a competition about open-endedness and demonstrates open-endedness, or is a proxy for the fact that open-endedness is going on. To what extent does this create a pressure or a reward for people who have created open-ended algorithms?
Yeah, so in my mind, it's roughly 50-50 between the two different tracks. Curriculum generation is one side of the coin, and then getting as much out of the curriculum as possible is the other side of the coin. And the reason that I've decided to have both of these as primary tracks instead of, say, just focusing on open-endedness is because of the relative size of the reinforcement learning community. So specifically, all of the previous competitions, we've had hundreds of different entries, and those people would likely come on over and be very interested in adding task conditionality to the RL loop, which is something that is important to take advantage of that generated curriculum of tasks. So I think it is important to have both sides of things. But there's definitely the other half that is the generation of curricula itself, which is most amenable to methods and open-endedness.
Yeah, and I think when we send out information on this track, we'll be sending out the diff model, like access to a diff model, as well as a copy of a talk that Joel had done about a week ago on motivation for open-endedness, in hopes that while open-endedness might not be the only solution to solve the first track, we can at least encourage people a little bit to think about solutions along that avenue. The goal of the first track is not to promote open-endedness solutions. I would more rephrase it as encourage a very large community to think about open-endedness more seriously.
It also is what lets you take advantage of open-endedness in the first place, right? Like, there are a lot of domains right now that I think are not showing the full potential of having a generated curricula, an open-ended like process that generates you a curriculum of tasks. So once you actually have the method that, if given a good curriculum, could take advantage of it, you're going to start to see, I think, a lot more emphasis on the open-ended methods that can be then, you know, actually lead into something down the pipeline.
So I really like the separation of these two, having these two tracks and then the one that combines them. Question I have that is something that's not very clear to me is, so in the first track where you are allowed to change the curriculum, the 25,000 training tasks remain the same, or are you allowed to also modify those in some way? And also wondering whether, so for the, I guess the final, the first track, are you allowed to modify the sort of like layout of the game and play with like generate the actual tasks? Are you allowed to basically modify anything at all, or is it still like a fixed set of training tasks and you're sort of only allowed to play with the order that the agents trains on them?
Yeah. So I hadn't actually thought of adding additional things outside of the task modification. You certainly could make an argument that, yeah, let's make it even more open-ended and allow you to have access to the environment configuration parameters as well. However, I think that the place that we would want to do that is in the second track, as part of the generation of curriculum. The intent of the first track was just for people to iterate on the reinforcement learning side of things with a entirely fixed curriculum. So this is like what models, what training algorithms and such will lead to a more robust and general policy. They were not even going to have control over the order that the tasks were presented in. That was the intent there. So really, it's RL people can focus on pure RL, and it's still going to be an interesting problem because there's very little in RL right now, especially in game RL, that is task conditional. So that's sort of the novelty of the first track, and then the second track has all the open-endedness stuff bundled up in it. And I do like I do like your suggestion of additionally allowing people to modify the terrain parameters and such for training time in addition to the tasks.
So wait, which one is the first and second? Generally say curriculum generation track is the first you're talking about.
First track is RL, second track is open-endedness.
Okay, sorry, I might have mixed them up in my question.
I should have, we should just label them, like it's the RL track and the open-endedness track from there on. We don't need numbers.
Okay, so it's curriculum generation, generalization, and no holds barred.
Yeah, it's like the task conditional RL, open-ended curriculum gen, and then no holds barred track. Those are the three.
Okay, generalization, task conditional RL. Okay, so it's interesting. I mean, I also like, I mean, it feels like curriculum generation track is most interesting to discuss because it's the most novel thing in a sense, least common thing. And it's like, I mean, Jeff's questions about how much is this actually competition open-endedness is a very interesting one because in a sense, it's an open-endedness competition is a little bit of an oxymoron, right? But, you know, we're sort of, you know, it's about doing the best we can with this, right?
Yeah, you need something that you can define and optimize towards in order to have a competition, right?
Yeah.
That's why I was having some fun with the question, because it's a fascinating thing to say, how would you hold an open-endedness competition? And this is one instance of it. I don't think it's entirely an oxymoron, Julian, if you had some magical, beautiful oracle. And I was thinking about this while Joseph was talking. Like, here's an idea that you could throw out to the community. Imagine if you had a critic, an evaluator of what's going on inside of like a virtual world. For example, like a captioning model, like Clip on steroids, that goes from video to a text description of what's happening, or even a human oracle, but humans are expensive. But yet, you know, basically you had humans sitting there sports casting, whatever weird things they were seeing. And then if you had a model that said, then if you had a measure of whether or not a person's algorithm was open-ended, it would be, does it continuously generate new text descriptions? And the agents in the world are not optimizing toward that goal, so you avoid Goodhart's law. I know that I'm taking us a lot far away from the current competition, but I'm just kind of having some fun here. Then you could imagine that you would evaluate if somebody has a good open-ended algorithm based on the fact that they satisfy this metric, which is, are you constantly doing new things? And that, I think, maybe would not be an oxymoronic version of a OE competition. What do you think, Julian?
How do you define new things?
That is not trivial, but yeah, obviously that's
super. We get into with all of this, right? It's like yeah, this is not the full formulation of open-endedness because you can't really have a competition around this, but certainly success at this competition would make it a lot easier to explore these problems. So I see the sort of the competition format as complementary to research, where you can have these clearly defined goals and optimize towards them, and then the solutions to those goals let you explore sort of less well-defined things.
Well, just riffing on kind of what Jeff is saying and what you're saying, Joseph. I mean, there are kind of competitions that are more qualitative, and in some sense that could be just intrinsically kind of like in a perfect world what we would aim towards. Like I think like Sebastian Risi had like a virtual creatures competition that I was involved with at some point, and you involve judges that are going to look at the products of it and try to ascertain, like, actually does this feel like it's in the direction of open-endedness? And I can see that there's like some tension here if you want to automate it. And like Jeff's proposal, someplace, in the middle where maybe there's some place you could actually you have a human model of a judge that is sort of, doing archaeology within the system as it unfolds. So there's, I think, a lot of interesting ideas. It does seem like maybe one focal point here is like, potentially this could be sort of like a kind of a benchmark that's aimed at things like paired algorithm or like, recent kinds of, problem solution type algorithms, which is just one facet of open-endedness, but maybe there's like a need for some benchmark that was a little bit beyond kind of what currently exists in that space.
Mhm.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, right, it's like, it's very difficult to have this tension between open-endedness being greatness cannot be planned, right, and also greatness is difficult to evaluate, but then also trying to get something more concrete that we can make consistent progress on, right? So yeah, the hope with this is that at least we get some facet of open-endedness out of this, like the curriculum generation, progress on methods, certainly a lot more eyes on open-endedness as a problem structure in general with these competitions, perhaps even get some of the RL people over to this as a, an important problem as well, and just keep it grounded for now. And hopefully this allows us to explore more interesting things going later down the line, right?
You see it as basically a competition. We're aiming towards open-endedness, but it's actually a competition about methods that could be used in open-endedness in a sense. Yeah, it's like preparing for open-endedness kind of. I wanted to bring up what Joel just brought up at some point later on, but I mean, it could be good to bring up like human evaluation in the end for this kind of thing is obviously gold standard. So Joel brought up the virtual creatures competition. There's also the generative design in Minecraft competition, which I've been involved in, where, there's a lot of work going into this, and but we actually have people with some kind of relevant qualifications like game designers or architects and so on, looking at the stuff that's generated by the generators. And it is a very fascinating process where a lot can be learned from. But the problem is, of course, that humans don't scale well, in particular, like qualified humans. But you could, there's a possibility, might not this time or some point, to basically have like a top layer, like the very best things, the solutions that fulfill the metrics best, the 5 best or so on, they get put before in front of a panel of judges that sort of basically look at how inventive are they really. I mean, how inventive are the behaviors that the bots come up with?
Yep, that's a
Can I
great
ask you
idea
a
to add
question?
on in addition. I'm very hesitant to try to like replace a core objective criterion, right, with a subjective human evaluation. Also, especially because what we found in this competition, it is so important to have a good, fast feedback mechanism to get people engaged. But certainly, once you have the top submissions by this objective criterion, which are going to be likely the most interesting ones anyways, you can see of these by human judges, which is sort of the most qualitatively interesting or produces new solutions or so on.
Yeah, or if they're not, which is also very possible that, someone comes up with something that really aces objectives, but is terribly boring, and aces objectives in an uninteresting way, then that's great information for how to tweak the competition next time.
And actually, we've done this in the Ichkai competition. There was a very significant exploit that was found that made it much easier to farm to power level early in the game. and all of the participants ended up exploiting it. And then we fixed that in the NERPS competition, so that was no longer a potential strategy. They came up with something else to exploit, but it didn't result in as boring as results as the previous one. So, this is a constant balancing process. The same thing happens in live games.
I think Jeff has his hand up.
Yeah, you can just
I
talk.
do have, yeah. Are you guys going to turn on the videos, or are we just content to be audio?
Oh, I thought you had the ability to do that. I wasn't watching.
No,
Yeah,
we can't turn it on.
We still can't do that.
Can they, if they're
I'll
made
let you work.
co-hosts, can they turn video?
I'll let you work on that in the background. So my question to anyone, but right now targeted towards Julian. Let's assume you have a human judge for free, or thousands of them. What I think is interesting to think about vis-a-vis this competition is, what would you be asking them to judge? Would you be looking at a final policy and saying, are you smart? Because that's kind of what this is measuring. Do you generalize? Are you smart? Can you handle new situations? So maybe even a better term than smart is, are you generalized? Are you a generalist? Are you adaptable to a new terrain? Or would the human's job, if it's open-ended competition, be to look at training across time and say, there's two things you could think about. Did you continuously do new things? Or did you continuously learn? And those are related but subtly different concepts. And so I'm wondering, to help Joseph and you in your competition, if it might help to think about kind of, I got back to my original question, to what extent is this revealing that open-endedness has happened, and maybe and to kind of sharpen the motivation, or at least the communication of the motivation, to say something like, we are interested in algorithms that learn in an open-ended way in an arbitrarily new task distribution, and evidence of the fact that open-endedness has happened is that you learned enough from this task distribution that you became able to generalize to a new target environment.
This was sort of the motivation behind having increasingly disparate held out tasks, right? So like, if you have a policy that's able to generalize not only to new tasks from the same distribution, not only to like rejection sample tasks against the baseline, but then even to things that we have hand designed out of the box, that to me seems like you've been able to keep coming up with new solutions. And potentially, there are other methods that we could do. There are other things we could do just with the top few submissions. We could, for instance, retrain them at larger scale and see which continue to develop new solutions when we do that. We could fine tune them on some of the harder tasks to see which, if you give them just a little bit of oomph, are able to adapt to things that are just really out there and far away from the initial task distribution. There are a number of different ways that we could model this, but in my mind, at least, these are approaches that you can think about looking at on the top few submissions. It's much harder to frame a whole competition around that, or really any sort of research where you have to have fast automatic evaluation.
It sounds to me like there are some assumptions in there that I think are worth making explicit. It sounds like you're saying, if you are able to zero shot a new environment, particularly an environment that is maybe a little bit farther away from the task distribution or was out of the task distribution, then open-endedness has happened. That's like an indication of an OE process. And also maybe with what you just said, that a second thing is that if you can few shot learn a new, maybe different kind of task, that is also evidence that OE has happened. Is that true, that those are two assumptions you're making?
So I guess in my mind, it's, if you don't have an open-ended process, you're only going to be able to work on the tasks. In the best case, you're only going to be able to work on the tasks that you've been trained on. A slightly more general system should be able to solve tasks in the same distribution. A more general system than that should be able to solve tasks that get a little bit farther away. And then as you continue sort of down that chain of generalization, you should be able to solve tasks that get farther and farther away from the initial distribution. Eventually, they're going to get so far away that they don't make any sense. You have to at least be able to train on them a little bit, but you do want a process that, with that little bit of training, can continue to solve those tasks. And that's, aspects of that result were in the XLAND paper. This is sort of a way to sort of continue and refine on those in sort of a larger many agent system as well. And ideally in a way that's much more computationally efficient and that can be built on in future research more easily as well.
I agree with all of that in terms of that all being evidence of generalists.
Generalization. There
yeah,
might be distinctions that you're drawing here in other things that open-ended processes should be able to do, which, you know, I'd be more than happy to entertain which aspects of these we could potentially include. A key thing, though, in the competition is that we do need to be able to measure the results and measure them quickly. So, you know, if generalization to new tasks is not all of what open-endedness is, right, which I think you'd probably agree that there's more to it, at least having this aspect pinned down makes it easier to investigate those other aspects of open-endedness, right?
Yeah, I think that it's maybe just worth making it explicit that we're treating the ability to produce generalists as a proxy for the fact that open-endedness has happened.
Yeah, which is fair. They're also, I mean, on the method side, you're also getting progress on open-endedness methods that could be used in other situations. I mean, we're explicitly looking at generating a curriculum, right? We're not just looking at if the policy can by any means necessary generalize to new tasks. We're looking specifically at the curriculum it was trained on and how we generate that curriculum.
Yeah, maybe just like an overriding tension is that, yeah, maybe just harping what other people have harped on before, just like open-endedness will mean different things to different people. And some people would argue that, you know, focusing on agents that generalize would create methods that would be, you know, aligned with that. But that if we mean something else by open-endedness, then whether those algorithms are useful for that or not, like it's maybe a little bit unclear. Like, so I'm curious, like just zooming out a little bit, like, you know, when you think about what, you know, getting a lot of participants in this competition, you think like, you know, what would be interesting to you as an outcome? Like, so maybe that there are new RL methods or something, like papers published on this topic, or this being kind of like an established benchmark for at least some facet of open-endedness, kind of like about the, like another benchmark in the poet paired, repaired kind of space or something.
Yeah, what I would like to see is that when you're given an environment that has flexibility over the details of the environment itself and how you define tasks on it, you have algorithms that are able to come up with a set of tasks that will train generalizable policies. And then given a fixed set of tasks, you're able to get the most general policy out of them. So together, taken together, you're able to have an algorithm that will come up with a set of tasks that produces a policy that can become as general as possible by training on those tasks. And this is not all of open-endedness, right? It's very difficult, especially when people don't agree on the definitions. But in my mind, this seems like it would be very difficult for this result to not be useful to other open-endedness research for any sort of broad, reasonable set of definitions.
So one thing I'm curious about is how you think about the evaluation part. I think there are multiple ways of basically setting this up, and some of them might be sort of, let's say, more open-ended, at least at evaluation time, than others, not necessarily about the process that leads you to the final agent. But I think one way to make the evaluation more open-ended might be to open it up or sort of crowdsource handcrafted levels and or games or tasks and so on from I don't know, from humans basically, or even allow them to play against humans or something like that. I'm curious how you're thinking about these different choices.
Yeah, the only thing we have to be careful there is that participants don't somehow get access to those levels and then, like, you know, to have that held out evaluation set at train time. Potentially we can come up with checks against that and find a way to sort of to crowdsource some of these tasks. The other option is that we sort of hand design them as the authors, similar to as was done in the XLAN paper. I think that there are sort of trade-offs with either of these approaches, and that sort of would be an implementation detail of the competition. We'd potentially try out both if it seems that, you know, that we're actually getting a lot of more interesting results out of the handcrafted one. I mean, out of the participant ones, then we can do more of that going forward, right? This is all unexplored terrain.
I think that could be a pretty nice, I guess, like unique feature of this competition, right? Because I don't think so many of them open it up to, especially with agents, right? There aren't that many that open it up to humans to play with them or create levels that can play on and so on. And that's definitely something that was missing from the excellent paper.
I would absolutely want to have a tool in which you can enter new tasks and see if the policy is generalized to them, whether or not that a set of specific crowdsourced tasks is used for the actual evaluation of the policies in the competition is going to be sort of like a security thing with whether or not those can be maintained and sort of not trained on directly. But definitely I want to have the ability for people to interact with the final policies and see how general they are by proposing new tasks.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Roberto said here. I think it would really be, I mean, again, realize not everything can be done now, but it's sort of, I think human involvement is useful in many ways. I'm not sure why I'm so pro-human so all of a sudden, but it's both to basically injecting useful information and to evaluate things, but also like if we zoom out to the big philosophical thing, we want open-ended learning of what? There is this very big risk of we seeing open-ended learning of like a progression of weird things changing that we don't even understand. Which could be interesting in its own way, but if we allow humans to play with and to directly challenge the bots in one way or another, basically set little tasks for them. This is also like a response to Jeff, like Jeff's question: what do you want humans to look for? I think that the way to look for things and the way to evaluate both curriculums and bots is to sort of play with them, to sort of interact with them. So not really evaluate just like a video of them doing interesting things, but like go in and poke them and see how they will react to that, essentially.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to see that happen. The only reason that I haven't done that thus far is just limited personal engineering bandwidth. If we have contributors that want to make the client human playable, and like let you really engage with the bots and challenge them in different ways, that would be great. And the environment's not too far off of making that possible.
No, true. That would be
a
really
little bit of engineering effort.
Actually, we should ask Charity if they're interested in, yeah, and in that aspect. So we've been working a bit with that. It's like we're thinking in similar terms with some of the game generation efforts here, because basically I have some experience of trying to set up some kind of game generation, especially generating game rules, and something comes out on the other end, which the evaluation metric says is great, and you can sort of reason yourself to why this would be useful, because like, hey, here's an interesting challenge progression in this task. It's just that you as a human with all your human biases and capabilities just don't understand any of it. It just makes no sense. So I mean, this is like, I guess there's not a right and wrong here, more like an interesting philosophical question: which kind of open-endedness? Open in which direction?
Yeah, this comes back to the idea of there not being like a, like there not being a fixed definition that people are going to agree on for like, how do we measure open-endedness of a system? And this is why we keep getting into human evaluation and the like. My take on this is and has always been like, yes, we need these. Yes, there should be some aspects that are human evaluated and that let us measure how well we're doing on this end that's less pinned down, but certainly making progress on the elements or in the aspects that we can pin down, let us then look at, the sort of the less well-defined things and to make progress there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with that to some extent, but it seems like the hard to pin down aspects of it, if those are really the core of it, then there's, I think, some risk of losing the forest for the trees, which is interesting. Like talking about the challenge, like of looking at videos like the ones that you showed and trying to infer from those videos kind of like what actually is happening and what makes it interestingly complex. That feels like a different problem, which is really interesting. And I feel like there hasn't been, maybe there is a lot of work I'm not familiar on, but like how you can create like an automatic agent that explains from some complex behavior and the conditions that led to it. Like why actually, what highlighting the interestingness of it. Like if you go to an art gallery, there'll be some little card by a painting that tells you kind of the motivation for that painting, that contextualizes it. And it makes it a lot easier to like actually go to an art gallery sometimes, and understand like what the artist was thinking and why it's interesting or important. And it feels like that kind of stuff kind of gets often kind of brushed to the side because it's a harder problem.
I've got a fun little story on that actually, real quick. So the week before the OpenAI Dota tournament, that they were going to play OG, I hadn't played Dota before, and I really wanted to understand that result. And really, that is such a complicated game that there is no way that a paper is going to be able to tell you how impressive that result is. So I took the whole week and played Dota leading up to that. And that was barely like tip of the iceberg understanding of how complex that game is, but at least I had some appreciation of the depth of the result from that. So similarly, I think that this comes back to the thing that Julian said about having this be human playable. Once people can sort of play the game, perhaps share snippets of replays of stuff that they've seen, specific policies submitted doing, once there's like, you know, better interpretability around the game and it's treated as sort of a game as a first citizen, not just a research viewer for an environment, I think it'll be a lot easier to then understand some of the things that are actually being discovered and learned.
I do worry. I like similarly to what you're talking about now. Like when you're watching these things, it was apparent to me very, very much that you know this domain so well that you can look at this and say, you know, to immediately infer what's going on and appreciate the complexity of it. But that's going to be very difficult for people that haven't immersed themselves in this domain.
There's a trade-off, right? There's always a trade-off between being able to have something that's complex and being able to interpret it, right? A lot of these, like the really big results, like you can't appreciate OpenAI 5 or AlphaStar or any of these without deeply understanding the level of complexity of the game that it was trained on. So I don't really think that there is a way around this where we're just going to come up with a domain where it's super simple to understand all the complexity that's going on. I think it's just that we're going to have to make it something that you can play with, that you can sort of like read up on, that you can engage with and learn what's happening from there. And then if the platform becomes big enough and becomes used by enough people, then it will just become commonly understood that this result is impressive because people understand the domain.
And just to push back on that a little bit, like I think if you had like an open-ended kind of system in Minecraft that was working well, it was like inventing kind of like, you know, Turing machines and all sorts of kind of crazy stuff. Like I think you could look at it and be like, wow, something crazy happened there. And I guess like I wonder, what's the quality of an environment that has that sort of like, you know, immediate sort of like click to it. Like, you know, like you don't have to be trained naturalists to like look at nature and be like, wow, that's incredible that there's all these creatures that solve life problems in so many different ways. Like, you know, a child can kind of appreciate that. Yeah.
I don't know.
You can't understand the difference between things that are all very complex, right? Like you can understand a machine that's made in Minecraft is complex, but like if you look at some of the absolutely ridiculous things that people have built in that, it's sort of hard to understand how complex some of them are, right? So that's sort of the difficulty. Like here, I can also show some clips and it's like, okay, there's something cool going on here, but then evaluating one policy versus another, you know, what is one strategy doing that another isn't, that is where you start needing the domain expertise to make those finer grained distinctions.
I would like to somewhat disagree with Joel here because basically, sure, nature, we look at nature, I think it's very, very fascinating because we know something about it. But like, for example, we may all here know that ants have this very complex society structure and we like marvel at it and they can do amazing things collectively. But if no one ever told you that, and you never spent a lot of time digging in anthills, you would just think they were like, you know, very simple beings and very stupid. And I think most people think that.
Yeah, I think that that's true in like a, you know, if you really narrow in a specific thing, but just looking at the grandeur of nature, like that just strikes you. Like a child will look at kind of, could go to a zoo and kind of be compelled for a long, long time, not because, you know, they need to understand the details of kind of ant society, but because it's just kind of like immediately apparent. It's like, it's kind of like the, you know, I'll know it when I see it sort of thing. And I feel like, you know, some domains, you know, have that property and some domains may not easily afford that same know when you see it kind of aspect.
I would say the same, that in direct analogy to Joseph's machine, you might look at a machine in Minecraft and not know how complex it is, just like you might look at an anthill and not appreciate its full complexity. But when you just walk around a jungle, you're just like, even if you miss out on how complex the ants are, you're just blown away by all the stuff that's there and how cool it all is.
Yeah. There's some truth to it. At the same time, it could be like, you could be very impressed by something that is psychologically very, very kind of limited environment. Like you go up in the mountaintop and there's not much happening there biologically, but you're like impressed by that it's a mountaintop or something. And then you go to the jungle and it's just hot and sweaty and annoying.
I do that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's just my own experiences here. I prefer the mountaintop, like personally, but it's like
Yeah, I do that same thing a lot, right? It's very subjective and it's difficult to measure these things. I will say you do get like in games specifically, like when you've played a lot of stuff, right? You do kind of get the sense of like, okay, this is something special. There's something complex going on in this game. I don't fully understand it yet. And like, yes, we would like to have the real world be our choice domain for this. It's just that it's so much more convenient to be doing things in game-inspired environments now because of the computational efficiency, the ease of defining things, and the entire games industry existing and telling us how to write these things in ways that are easy to define and efficient.
yes.
If you guys don't mind, I want to change. We're a little bit low on time, so I want to
Yep.
pivot a bit to something that's been on my mind throughout this conversation. So it's going back a little bit to some of the stuff I said earlier, but this conversation has been fascinating, and the idea of an open-ended competition itself fascinating because it really brings to bear like what do we mean by open-endedness and what would be evidence of it. And it strikes me that one thing that's essential for open-endedness is that it's a dynamic process across time. It's constantly changing. Almost by definition, that's what the field is after. And so you have this track 3, the no holds barred track, where you basically say, we'll give you the task distribution ahead of time, and you can train as much as you want. You can give us an agent that is a generalist, and then we'll say you won the no holds barred open-endedness competition. I want to suggest, I'm not sure to what extent it's logistically possible, but I want to suggest that maybe a different or maybe more fully open-ended no holds barred competition would be you hand us an algorithm and we put it in a domain that you don't know anything about ahead of time. And you have to produce endless diversity if you knew how to measure that, or maybe a proxy for that, which is the ability to, I don't know, be a generalist in that domain or learn in that domain or achieve high performance in that domain. But the domain itself is what's sight unseen, and the distribution of tasks is sight unseen. So maybe you hand us an RL learning algorithm and a curriculum generation algorithm, and we will run it for you in this entirely new thing. And that will be a test of whether you have created a process that is truly open-ended in the sense that it continuously does interesting things wherever you place it. It's a universal open-ended algorithm. And that could be very, very difficult, but not impossible for what you're doing. And that would be kind of an interesting, I think, extra dimension of challenge to put into an open-ended competition. Yeah, I'm seeing the annex score. Yeah, you could use that from Poet, for example.
The difficulty here, this is something that I'd like to work towards as well long term. Just the difficulty here, having worked in like making these environments and seeing if we can get stuff working on them for the past 5 years, there is a huge amount of domain specific tooling that's required to make whatever algorithm you hand me do well in that specific environment, which is why right now I'm trying to say, here's a complicated domain, we'll do that tooling as much as possible for you. And then you just have to make sure that your algorithm works with that tooling. When you don't even know what that stuff is going to be ahead of time, I get concerned about the feasibility of something like that for now. Actually, part of the reason that I want to run these competitions is so that we can build up that tooling, right, and have it be more general to stuff like that over time. I just think that on the engineering side, we're just not even close to there yet, and there are very few people even looking at this.
Yeah, none of this is a complaint about what you got going on now. I just having some fun,
like I see the
thinking
long
about
term
it
of
from
it as
first
well,
principles.
right? It's like I keep trying to bring stuff back down to earth because I see that there are a number of aspects, right, that we can make progress on right now. But I'm not missing the the bigger picture of this. I'm just trying to like get us something that we can make progress on short term and still produce interesting results, and that hopefully will let us look at these ideas more formally in the future.
Yeah, I really like Jeff's idea. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem that hard, right? If you assume, let's say, can create a bunch of these environments to start with same like observation space and action space, and maybe different parameters that you can change in the environment to just create tasks, but you have no idea what they are. Doesn't seem like it's probably not going to happen in this competition, but maybe next ones that would be super cool.
Well, wait, there would be new tasks, right? Like you only have a sample of the initial tasks that are going to, like even in the third track, you only have a sample of initial tasks, and then you get tested on tasks from the same distribution, but then also tasks that are out of that distribution that we've just come up with, right? So there is still that element of generalization to new stuff that you haven't even seen before. It's still within the same platform and system, which is what allows you to have the same observation space, action space, and share all the tooling.
Right. I guess, yeah, I was thinking like completely different, dynamics or games that you haven't,
Oh,
I mean, just like what Jeff said, right? That you have no
yeah,
idea what they are. I don't know,
I
beast and I don't know, poet, like whatever what poet was trained on, or like some continuous, or I don't know. Yeah, like some excellent stuff, or I mean, completely,
well, like poet
mm,
over different
creative.
terrain generation, like that's fine. In my mind, just having tasks is like a different access, a sort of a higher level access of generalizing to different terrain. Like another way that you could run this competition that I don't think would be as interesting would just be that like you have to generalize to new maps and there's one task, right? And we just give you new maps with new terrain that you've never seen before. Um, right now, we do make you generalize to new maps. It's just that they're drawn from the same distribution for convenience, because I think that that's sort of the tasks, the higher level and more interesting thing to look at for now.
I guess one thing that is a little bit different than what I was proposing is that the unseen stuff is not just a thing you use at test time after training. That a true open-ended process will innovate forever in a new domain, which to some extent it means that it has to train in this new, totally new domain. And so the no holds barred task 3 says you get to go train on this predetermined task space and then hand me a generalist, which you could produce via a non-open-ended algorithm, right? You could just literally with a huge amount of compute, just train on the whole thing and then hand something over. But if you had an open-ended algorithm and you didn't know and you had to place it into an unknown domain and then it had to innovate endlessly, then that's maybe getting at a different dimension, or maybe a more kind of aligned definition of open-endedness.
So what would this look like? Would this look like here we have a really hard set of held out tasks, but you can fine tune on them a bit, and we see if you're able to solve a bunch of new tasks that you couldn't solve before? Or like how would you formalize that process in something that you can test?
What if you had at competition time, you give me an algorithm that will train agents and select tasks, and there's like an API for task selection that is general enough that you could plug in any domain,
Yep.
or any variant of an MMO, different type of domain. And then, but you don't know ahead of time what it's going to be. And maybe at inference time, you're going to learn to solve logic puzzles, or maybe you're going to run obstacle courses in a virtual
Oh,
world,
geez.
or, and I'm not saying, you want it to be, this is all about MMO. So there could be different kind of flavors of domains within MMO, but, I'm just thinking from first principles that
Yeah.
if somebody had a really like amazing open-ended algorithm, then arguably the proof of that is that I could put it in any number of a bunch of different domains, and it would interestingly learn and innovate in any of those
Yeah.
over time. And so the measure a little bit is what happens over learning and over time, not like what is the final agent produced or one agent produced. I'm curious what you think, but also what Joel and Julian think, and I guess all of the panelists, about this kind of Roberta as well. Like, does this get to the spirit of open-endedness, and is this something that would impress you as like yeah, that's some evidence that we have open-ended algorithms, are good or bad ones?
Yeah, I appreciate the prompt, Jeff, because like, yeah, for me, it helps illuminate kind of like maybe the ways in which I see the core of the problem differently, or at least it's clarifying for me and myself within myself. So to me, it seems like, it's all about the process, so that it would continue going indefinitely and discovering all the interesting things within a domain. And I guess it's some way in which generalization somehow, doesn't seem to tease that out. That, like if you put us in an arbitrary strange domain out of a distribution, and maybe we could learn to do it or something over time. But it's more like, just would it take on a directionality of its own, keep exploring all the possibilities domain offers. So I don't know that the kind of like switching to a new domain and now training further like exactly captures that. I guess I'm still drawn to sort of like, I'll know when I see it sort of heuristic, which isn't that useful for driving objective research. But with humans in the loop, you can kind of get more towards that. So I guess that's my take, but I'm curious what everyone else
Okay.
thinks.
Joel, I've got something that I think you're gonna like here that should help ground all of this. So in my mind, I guess the assumption I've been making that I should make explicit here is that if you were to have an agent that can play an MMO like a human does, or even solve an MMO, so to speak, that in my mind requires a process that if it's not open-ended in the way that it is in the real world, it's much more open-ended than anything that we have now, just because of I know how much different stuff there is that you can do in these sorts of environments, and like how many different problems there are to solve, and how much time it takes to chain together the solutions to solve them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so I guess that's where we like have a different crux or something, because I wouldn't come to the same conclusions. That's useful.
Yeah, I guess you'd come to that conclusion about the real world though, right?
Well, in the sense that the real world, we built up everything.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not like that the complexity in the environment is kind of like hard coded, and the tasks in the environment come from like a limited space, but we invent our own tasks.
Right.
And we invent new fields of science and so on.
Like if you were able to have a system that could create, like keep creating all these inventions in the same way that humans are, that's an open-ended process, right? Now, like games are not that flexible, but there's an emergent space of strategies that will literally change over the span of 10 years plus on the same game when the game is actively played, right? So, and there are also like things that get added to the game over that time. The domain can be changing, and you still get more and more and more discoveries based on them. So like that, in my mind, we don't have any domains at all that we can look at in reinforcement learning or in agent-based intelligence in general that we can do that on. So in my mind, if we were at least able to do this, we would be a lot closer to understanding how to create processes that could potentially do the same thing in the real world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll have to think more about that. I still have this kind of like.
It's really it comes down to like the game domain stuff, right? Like it comes down to your inspiration and like how truly complex you believe that the games that these environments that are inspiring it, how complex those games truly are. I guess I have a very high estimation of the complexity of some of these games.
Let's do last round of comments because we're already going over time.
Can't hear you, Lewis.
Oh, you can't hear me?
Now I hear you.
Okay, well let's do last round of comments because we're already kind of going over time. So if anyone has like last words on that, I'm sure that there's an infinite amount of questions to ask, but let's try to keep this to the hour 30 limit. Yep.
Are we looking? I didn't quite hear. Did you want us to take the chat questions?
I don't think we have time to do chat questions. If anyone has a chat question, can you please ask in the Discord and we'll get to it in the next like hour or two, realistically. But let's do final remarks from the panelists at the moment.
Yeah, Lewis, you're kind of roboting a bit.
Yeah, we can't. But I mean, there's a bunch of questions in the chat.
Okay, let me take a look at some of these.
I think what he said was that they'll address questions in Discord in the next few hours, but right now to wrap things up, because I think we're at time, he wanted to do a final round of comments from the clock. I think he suggested a final round of comments from the panel. Is that right, Lucas?
Yeah, we can do that. Anything final from the panelists in that case? And
well, I just want to say thanks
everyone for
yeah, I'll just say thanks for the invitation. I think it's super fun and fascinating to think about this, and this whole idea of a competition is a nice motivating forcing function to think about, not only this particular instance, but like other possible instances, which is fun, and then ideas that could be woven in the future. I think there is something very true. I think that there's a lot of power to generalists. The fact that you have generalists, you achieve an agent that can generalize in a big task distribution is definitely evidence that a lot of learning has happened. And probably in some very large task distributions, if you're doing that well, you could only do that within an effective curriculum that has learned a lot over time. And so that is evidence that you've had some key components of an open-ended process. And then I think it's also fun to think about for future versions of the competition, like what other key components might you want to measure. And as we were just discussing, I do think there's something to measuring not just the final, like a final output of such a system, but to look at what has happened over time as some measure of whether or not open-endedness is happening. So that's kind of a fun, maybe like a suggestion for things to think about for the future that I would kind of ask, leave on the table to be thought about.
Thank you. Yeah, any other last thoughts?
These, like, basically, there's so many more things that could be explored here, and
Right.
good, but open-endedness, exploring the space of ways which we could have a competition openness is in itself a kind of an open-ended thing. We just got to get this going and see what happens. I mean, clearly it will be, things will happen.
Yeah.
And there will be ways, and people complain that this isn't up to the spirit of what you wanted to measure, because that's always the case when you try to measure anything. But it's I mean, that would just tell us more about how to do open-endedness. So
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the hope, right? It's something concrete that we can do now. We have finally, after
Yeah.
all this time, we have the infrastructure in place to actually do something in this relative space. And then we
Yeah.
can see, what's missing, what can be done next from there.
Yeah, and I like, further down the line, I'd be strongly in favor of various kinds of human involvement of evaluation and so on. But yeah, it's like, that's further down the line, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear. I think this is a huge contribution to the community to start having these competitions, and also to engender these sorts of debates. It's better to learn by doing,
Yep.
which is super fantastic. So thank you for doing the work, and also for creating MMO, which is a great environment in which to study a lot of these questions. It's a really valuable asset.
And thanks for all the feedback on the panel.
I'm really excited to see what comes from this, Joseph.
Thank you.
Yeah, really, really great initiative.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, if anybody in the audience is potentially interested in contributing to the project as well, the main thing right at this point is going to be the engineering effort required to do all of this. We've got all these tools in place for the previous competition. They need to be sort of reassembled in a new configuration for this competition. And really at this point, I think we're at the place where we know how to do it. It's sort of like there's a known quantity finally around some portion of this at least. And we just need the developers who are wanting to do that. So if you're interested, please reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to chat. Any last comments from you, Lewis?
All right, maybe we can close it there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I will end the call then now.
Thank you.
So thank you very much to everyone. Once again, thank you once again to our panelists.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Good luck.
Thanks.